to sort of look up and look at the world as a whole rather than just looking down in their own community, their own area and the people that they're in connection with. And effective altruists think that we ought to live our life to make the world a better place for everybody.
Imagine you are on your way to your well-paying, high-performer business job, dressed in your best suit for the important presentation that you have to give today. You walk through a small park on your way to the business district. In the center of the park, there's a small pond where you sometimes sit for lunch. All of a sudden you are torn away from your thoughts about your presentation as you hear a child scream and frantically try to stay above the water in the pond. You know that the pond is too deep for the child to stand in. You look around and see no concerned parents looking for their child, and no one else who might be able to help. The child will drown if you don't jump into the pond immediately and rescue the child. Of course you know that doing so will ruin your expensive suit, and there's no way you will make it to your presentation on time if you save the child. What would you do? The Australian philosopher Peter Singer used a version of this thought experiment in his extremely influential paper Famine, Affluence and Morality from 1972. The answer, he thinks, is obvious. The loss involved in ruining your clothes, maybe even having to reschedule the presentation or missing out on a client, is nowhere near as important as the life of the child that you can save. So far so obvious, right? Why use such an example? The point of the example is to draw an analogy to people across the globe whose lives are in danger for the foreseeable future because of malnutrition or health problems. Issues that are in principle solvable, or at least treatable, with not too many financial losses for those living in relatively affluent societies. So why treat the two sides of the analogy any differently? Why save the child in your immediate vicinity at some cost to you, but not also donate to effective charities in order to save the child that soon might die of dehydration, starvation or illnesses? Proximity does not really seem to be a good reason not to help someone in need. If we assume that ethics is universal and impartial, then it is hard to see why the fact that someone is far away from you matters from the perspective of ethics, at least if we can easily help by donating to people who are far away. Seeing this argument being presented to people for the first time is always an interesting experience. When I taught the paper at university, the students generally felt a pull towards the conclusion of the argument. There really isn't an important difference between the thought experiment and what happens with people in need far away from us. Of course, there are problems with the argument and these are still debated today, but the influence of this paper and others like it on young students cannot be underestimated, I think. Our story about effective altruism starts with two young philosophers who were similarly influenced by Singer's paper and took its conclusions very seriously.
In terms of power to change the world, we live at an unprecedented time in human history. And I believe our ethical understanding hasn't yet caught up with this fact. What we need is an ethical revolution. For the last 10 years, my colleagues and I have developed a philosophy and research program that we call Effective Altruism.
William MacAskill and Toby Ord both studied philosophy, and as so many other people who focus on ethics, they were at some point confronted with the article by Peter Singer and publications like this that urge us to rethink the scope of our individual responsibility. What set MacAskill and Ord apart from many other philosophers is that they were deeply dissatisfied with the idea of only thinking about ethical arguments and philosophical theories. They were convinced that philosophy is not just about understanding the world, but about actually changing it. In their case, they didn't only want to know the best arguments why we ought to do good, but how to actually do good in the most effective way possible. This led them to ideas that they brought together under the umbrella term effective altruism. Effective altruism is about asking, how can I make the biggest difference I can? And using evidence and careful reasoning to try to find an answer. It takes a scientific approach to doing good. Just as science consists of the honest and impartial attempt to work out what's true and a commitment to believe the truth, whatever that turns out to be, effective altruism consists of the honest and impartial attempt to work out what's best for the world and a commitment to do what's best, whatever that turns out to be. Not only did MacAskill and Ord feel an urge to take action, but they wanted to know precisely the best possible action that there would be to take. And when they dug deep into the numbers, they were startled by the difference that effective charities can make compared to non-effective charities. In order to quantify and make comparisons between charities, they borrowed the notion of QALYs from economists. QALY means Quality Adjusted Life Year and tries to capture a common criteria for the quality of life experience. One QALY would be the quality of 1 year of life of a perfectly healthy individual with all needs fulfilled. You then have to empirically test how much impact different diseases, for example, have on the experience quality of life. According to McCaskill, for example, people who survived a stroke rate life at roughly 75% the quality that it used to be. If you assume that you can get such numbers, which many of course reject, you can start doing math and comparisons, which effective altruists are really into. An example that McCaskill likes to come back to is the decision to train guide dogs for blind people. According to the data he cites, it takes around $50,000 to provide a guide dog to a blind person, as training them can be very time-consuming and expensive. But simply donating the same amount of money to treat preventable blindness, such as in the one Mr. Beast video that people dunked on, can help many more visually impaired people than the guide dog can. This kind of mathematical ethics led the effective altruism movement, and especially McCaskill and Ort, to start several non-profit organizations. They themselves were involved in founding Giving What We Can in 2009, 80,000 Hours in 2011, and the Center for Effective Altruism. Giving What We Can tries to convince people to make pledges to donate at least 10% of their income for the rest of their lives, and then they point those who are willing to do so to the most effective charities according to their own research. 80,000 Hours informs people about the impact that different careers can have. If you are wondering what job you should choose if you want to make the most impact, you can consult them. 80,000 hours is the typical time that you will work in your life. Here, the effective altruist's notion of earning to give is very important. You might think that being a social worker or a physician is the most impactful that your working life can be, but you'd be wrong in thinking that, according to the effective altruists. Depending on your strengths, it might be better for you to go into finance or banking and make much more money than a social worker or even a physician would make. By donating effectively much of your money, you can have a greater impact than you would by pursuing the other available jobs. Beyond the institutions that McCaskill and Ort founded, a lot more was happening surrounding the effective altruism movement, and their movement heavily gained momentum. GiveWell was founded in 2007 by Holden Karnofsky and Ellie Hassenfeld, who used to work at a hedge fund, but were increasingly interested in figuring out the most effective ways of donating to charity. Later, Open Philanthropy joined the ranks, founded by Carrie Tuna and Dustin Moskovitz, the co-founder of Facebook. All of them shared the vision of doing good in the most effective way possible. It was during this time where the effective altruism movement went from a small social group of philosophers and activists to a giant social movement with a lot of money from people who worked predominantly in the tech industry. This led to more influence, but more importantly, more reach and attention. And this is where, beyond philosophers writing papers against effective altruism, things started to get problematic.
This video isn't positive news, it's a positive PR. Kurzgesagt admitted they wouldn't have made this video if it wasn't paid for by Gates. Okay, what the hell just happened?
In the second half of 2022, several YouTube videos were made that criticized some of the videos of the popular science channel Kurzgesagt. Two of the central criticisms were related to the content of Kurzgesagt videos and some of their funding. I've been watching Kurzgesagt for many years and have been a fan of their work ever since. In my estimation, if you wanted to put a label on their position, you might call it enlightened centrism. That's a term used in internet discussions that refers to people that are slightly on the left, but do not really agree with any more radical claims of the left, and sometimes fall into some pitfalls of rather conservative positions. If you are familiar with Kurzgesagt videos, you will know that they try not to have opinions, but aim to only provide the facts. And when they do share opinions, they clearly mark them as such. This is of course an idealized description on their side, as providing supposedly neutral facts can be influenced by your political outlook. And that is exactly what people have criticized Kurzgesagt for recently. They made videos on topics ranging from climate, overpopulation, dangers of parasites and vaccines, all sponsored by the Gates Foundation. All of these are talking points that are on top of the list of effective altruists. Kurzgesagt even featured a recently published book by William McCaskill on the idea of long-termism very prominently. And videos like these are sponsored by some of the institutions that we just talked about, such as Open Philanthropy. Remember when I said that effective altruism grew, became institutionally better established and spent more money on bringing their ideas to a broader audience? This is part of the effect of it. Now the point here is not to rehash the debate on Kurzgesagt, their opinions and their sponsors. But what's interesting is that the criticism that people brought up in the Kurzgesagt incident helps us to better understand the recent criticism of the effective altruism movement as a whole. One of Kurzgesagt's videos that received much attention was on climate change. The upshot of the video was that people should vote with their wallet. This means buying electric cars, supporting renewable energy and investing in new technologies such as carbon capture. This, I think, fits very well with the position that I called enlightened centrism. You acknowledge that there is a problem and that there needs to be change, but the actions that you ultimately support are not going to change anything fundamentally or rapidly. You don't touch the general economic system that we have, you simply try to shift it into slightly less destructive directions. My point here is not to say whether this is right or wrong. Rather, this sentiment is what explains much of the problems with the newer forms of effective altruism. Remember what we started with, Peter Singer's argument why donating to people is so important. If you take the argument seriously, it will ask much of you personally. This has been discussed in the academic debate as the problem that ethics would start to overwhelm individuals if that were true. When you think about whether you should go to the cinema tonight, you should think about how much the money you would spend on that could benefit another person. If not seeing the new movie in the theater is not that big of a deal, which it probably isn't, you instead ought to donate the money that you would have spent to someone who can drastically improve their lives with that. That was the upshot of Singer's argument. The institutional effective altruism movement is much less radical in that sense, and probably for good reasons. The Giving What We Can pledge asks people to donate 10% of their income. This is a significant setback for many people, but for the wealthier people this would not in the slightest amount to what they could do. This is technically also acknowledged by McGaskill when he mentioned that billionaires ought to donate 99% of their income. But effective altruists would never dare say that we ought to eat the rich. 80,000 Hours also often suggests that people ought to work within the system, in finance or banking, rather than trying to fundamentally reshape the system. In her video on effective altruism and long-termism, PhilosophyTube argued that this comes from data bias. You can roughly calculate the benefits of going into banking and donating 10% of your income for the rest of your life. But it is hard to put a number on how much it might help to fundamentally restructure our economic system, or at least the tax system. So things as radical as that simply aren't really on the radar of effective altruists. But it is important to emphasize that this is a choice. The theory or philosophy behind effective altruism is neutral on whether you should be a radical revolutionary, an enlightened centrist, or even a conservative. What you ought to do simply depends on what will help to do the most good. Effective altruists did a good job figuring out that some forms of donations are far more effective than others, and that we should probably prefer those which are best. But they do not give as much thought to structural changes as they cannot easily quantify them, so it gets swept under the rug. And it gets worse. As the institutional movement of effective altruism grew, became more famous and better funded, their priorities shifted away from the idea that donating as effectively as you can is the most important thing that ought to be on our minds. As I just mentioned, effective altruists, or at least related institutions such as Open Philanthropy, spent a lot of money on sponsoring videos like Kurzgesagt. The money was used to enable Kurzgesagt to make short-form content and translate their content into different languages. But in turn, some of their videos took the ideas of effective altruism as a topic. They weren't forced to do that, but this is where they align. At this point, we might want to ask whether effective altruism still aligns with their core values. Of course, spending money to reach more people to teach about effective altruism is in principle potentially valuable, if the greater reach leads to more people being convinced and donating their money. But this is at least as speculative as wanting to change the system, which doesn't get much attention from institutional effective altruism. What is more, not only do they spend much more money on speculative stuff, such as marketing, instead of donating the money more directly, but their focus has also moved on to other problems than poverty and health. Before the big days of effective altruism, global poverty and health were among the most important topics. This makes sense, as these are the areas where relatively little money can have a lot of impact on the quality of life of people. In McCaskill's first book on effective altruism, Doing Good Better, he also mentioned existential risks at the end, such as climate change, pandemics, and the dangers of bioengineering pandemics in the future, but they featured less prominently in his initial work. Now with his latest book, What We Owe the Future, things changed. He discusses the philosophy of long-termism, which many effective altruists now ascribe to. In a blog article on the effective altruism page, Finn Morehouse brings long-termism down to 3 core claims. Future people matter morally, the future could inhabit much more people than have ever lived in the past. Some projections claim that there could be trillions of people in the future. What we do now impacts the well-being of these future humans. Long-termism isn't just about the next couple of decades, but the next thousands of years and beyond that. Institutionalized effective altruism gained a huge interest in long-termism and spends millions of dollars on research on AI. The idea behind this, general artificial intelligence, could potentially be the doom of the whole of humanity. If that is true, the trillions of humans that would come to be never have the chance of being born. It's terrible if humanity is eradicated or eradicates themselves, so we should invest a lot of money in order to prevent this. The general idea of the argument isn't silly. Climate change will impact a lot of people negatively. So even if our money currently could save lives by being donated, we should also put some money into climate research and pay influential people to inform their audiences in order to prevent or mitigate the future harm. Nothing wrong about that. But where's this strong focus on AI coming from? It should strike fans of effective altruism as odd, because it is exactly the kind of speculative gamble that they typically reject in favor of database donations. How likely is it that AGI will wipe out humanity? How likely is it that research invested into AI can prevent that? What would it even mean for research to prevent that from happening? I don't want to say that having no idea about the likelihood of a thing happening should make us ignore that topic altogether. AI dangers are very real, but they are real even now, not only in the far future. Technologies are already used where people are being discriminated against based on data, and art is stolen from artists in order to generate AI pictures. The current obsession of institutional effective altruism on AI is odd, even on effective altruism's own terms. So where is it coming from? I can only speculate, but there is this curious correlation between institutional effective altruism being heavily funded by Silicon Valley type of people and billionaire investors, and effective altruists' new focus on long-termism and AI. Silicon Valley tech people and billionaires have been very keen in recent years to emphasize existential risks and the importance of saving humanity from extinction. These are likely the reasons why Elon Musk loses his mind over birth rates and going to Mars, and Silicon Valley investors cannot stop talking about the dangers of artificial intelligence. It's not that these aren't real issues. It is just that these types of people who now invest into effective altruism love to pride themselves with following topics that they are already interested in, and they might have a hidden savior complex that might lead them to see speculative existential risks and ignore current and real risks. If your movement is funded by a bunch of people who love tech and AI and maybe have a savior complex, well, then it might not be a total coincidence that you start talking about the existential risks of AI much more within your movement. Is that a problem? I think that it should be to effective altruists themselves, and that it also explains much of their recent downfall. People who were once drawn to effective altruism because of its goal to help as much as you can, even if it costs you significantly, are disappointed with the new focus on long-termism. Among these are well-known and influential people like Steven Pinker, who shared his disappointment in what I call the institutional rise of effective altruism and their focus on AI and long-termism. But one very hitting example came from Vlad Chittok, who shared their experience with donating a kidney, and how much less of an issue it was than you might think. And that is what effective altruism used to be about. Literally giving something significant up for the aim of doing good for others who are in a less fortunate position.
In the end, my goal is to do as much good as I can for the world. I'm part of an effective altruism community. Basically, it's a group of people looking to try and figure out, if you want to maximize the amount of good you do, maximize the positive impact that you can have on the world. What does that imply? What does that mean you should do?
Where does effective altruism stand now? After the disaster of their involvement with Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, things seem to have been quiet around effective altruism. McCaskill removed himself from the front row and now helps with fundraising and other projects more in the background. Media outlets now care less about effective altruism. At best you see some post-mortems posts that try to figure out where effective altruism went wrong and what its future could look like. One such post was shared by Scott Alexander, where he summarizes what effective altruism has achieved, specifically also with regard to AI safety. And indeed, with all the bad stuff that I have talked about, and the AI takeover of effective altruism that many people rightly are concerned about, most of its members still genuinely care about doing good better. And many of them do exactly that. I think such a takeover might be related to the very nature of effective altruism. Be rational. Don't be compassionate towards people that are near and dear to you. And calculate meticulously with all the available data what the most moral thing to do is. This is just conjecture, but it seems fitting that such a movement has been taken over by Silicon Valley tech people and billionaires. So maybe the best course of action is not to take the tenets of effective altruism too seriously if you really want to do the most good you can. Look at the numbers, but don't get lost in them. Try to spread the gospel of effective altruism, but don't become a salesperson. And maybe don't trust nerdy crypto billionaires who pretend to live a humble lifestyle and say that they want nothing more than to make the world a better place.